Considering all of the steps, all of the tests that have yet to be performed with the Starship, this particular moment seems so far away. And yet, in spite of this, the level of excitement amongst SpaceX enthusiasts, including myself, is as high as it ever was. And yet, to an outsider, the excitement might be pretty hard to understand. I mean, the Starship prototype is not going to orbit, not even close, not even using all of its engines. It's just performing a hop that's measured in kilometers instead of meters. I mean, what's the big deal? And these amazingly powerful Raptor vacuum engines that we've watched being tested, not going on board because, after all, the ship is not going into vacuum. So, what's the excitement? From what we can see from these images, generously provided by the way by Boca Chica Gal, who's been a partner of this channel for a long time now, and I urge you folks to follow the link in the description and subscribe to her if you haven't already. But that having been said, really, SN8, as this prototype is called, doesn't look a whole lot different than the previous ones, aside from the fact that we're adding fins, and we're going to be flying to a height of 20 kilometers, or wait a minute, no, it's actually 15 kilometers, according to Elon now. We've kind of taken a little bit of the ambition off of this flight, but for good reason, I think. So it just looks like a water tower with fins. Why is this so exciting again? Well, for those of us who want to see scenes like this in the future, this is the most important test so far that's been carried out with the Starship. It is absolutely critical that this test go off well eventually. Although it probably won't go off well the first time, it must go off consistently on a regular basis, flawlessly, if we expect to see scenes like this in the future. And more importantly, if we're going to be seeing scenes like this in the future, the purpose for which the Starship was actually created, transporting large numbers of personnel and cargo to the Red Planet, if this is even to be a remote possibility in the future, this test is going to have to come off well at some point. And even if it does, it's still not going to tell us everything we need to know about one of the most important parts of Starship development, what I call the Starship Suicide Dive. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. So, the moment is coming close. It has almost arrived. Well, not in terms of getting the Starship into orbit, or not even really for the Starship to go any place except up and down. And nevertheless, this is a very, very huge moment. As the Starship climbs to 20 kilometers, or was it 18, or no, it's 15 now. And actually, that's okay, because 15 kilometers is going to accomplish pretty much the same things as far as what we need to know about the Starship's capabilities, what needs to be done in terms of the landing procedure. All of these things can be accomplished with a 15-kilometer hop as much as we can with a 20-kilometer hop. Did I just say kilometer and kilometer in the same segment? I might have, I don't know. In any event, so what exactly do we hope to learn from this? Are we going to learn what happens during re-entry? Well, not exactly, no. Are we going to learn what's going to happen on Mars? Well, as you'll see in the course of the video, a little bit, but not a whole lot. So, what exactly is going to be accomplished by climbing up to 15 kilometers instead of 150 meters? What really are we going to gain in terms of knowledge about the Starship? What needs to be done? What needs to be tweaked? And if anything, and just how likely it's going to be for the Starship to accomplish everything that it needs to do given the current plans? Well, we're going to find all of that out right now. Now, as I mentioned before, this particular test is not going to teach us a whole lot about re-entry, at least in terms of the initial stage of it, where you're going to be looking at a fireball traveling across the sky. The 15-kilometer hop is not going to generate nearly that kind of heat, although, nonetheless, the ship will be equipped with a small patch of thermal tiles for testing. However, the test will teach us a lot about how the Starship performs in its skydiver role in terms of control being generated by its flaps and also by its reaction control thrusters. From an altitude of 15 kilometers, the Starship will reach terminal velocity very quickly, and then we'll be able to determine just how well it maneuvers under these conditions, and more importantly, how it lands. Now, the reason 20 kilometers is an important altitude is because this is the altitude that SpaceX anticipates that the Starship is going to level out and achieve subsonic speeds during re-entry. As you can see, SpaceX is estimating about 3 minutes of subsonic flight before it attempts a landing, but SN8 is going to have substantially more than that for a number of reasons. First of all, it's going to take a moment for it to get to terminal velocity after it reaches its 15-kilometer altitude. And then, even at full-out terminal velocity, which in our atmosphere is about 200 kilometers per hour, it will take about 4.5 minutes to reach zero altitude from 15 kilometers. Now, the fins should make the dive a bit less than terminal velocity, so actually the entirety of the dive, even from 15 kilometers, is probably going to be significantly more than 4.5 minutes, giving the Starship engineers plenty of time to test the control and stability of the Starship during its dive. This extra time should give SpaceX the time they need to make sure the Starship comes down where they want it to. But what I'm particularly interested in is when are they actually going to do this particular crazy pull-up maneuver that they're going to execute in order to land on Mars or even on Earth. Personally, I hope they do it as late as possible in the process. Now, the reason I'm hoping for this is that although ships in Earth orbit, like tankers and that sort of thing, are going to have the luxury of pulling up earlier, thus reducing the chance of a crash, that's not what's going to be happening on Mars. Ships re-entering Earth's atmosphere are going to, of course, have the luxury of a much thicker atmosphere, and they're probably going to have more fuel available to them as well. Let me explain why. Now, in order to explain this, we need to review quickly how the Starship is going to get to Mars in the first place. First, the Super Heavy, after delivering the Starship into orbit, needs to return to Earth in order to pick up a tanker in order to refuel the Starship. Now, according to Elon Musk, the process of loading a new tanker onto the Super Heavy and launching it into low Earth orbit to refuel the Starship needs to be repeated 6 times in order for the Starship to reach Mars in a relatively reasonable time frame, about 5 to 6 months. And why is this? Well, it's because of the damn gravity of our home planet. It requires all of the fuel in the Super Heavy and nearly all of the fuel in the Starship in order to achieve low Earth orbit with 100 tons. Therefore, the tanker can only deliver 100 tons of fuel at a time. So 6 refuelings will only deliver about 600 tons, or roughly 50% of the Starship's capacity. Now, you could totally refuel the Starship with 13 tankers, but there comes a point to where this thing starts to become inefficient and really implausible. 6 tanker refuels is going to be difficult enough as it is, so I agree with Elon that 6 is about right. The problem is, with about 600 tons in the tank, the Starship will be able to get up to speed to get to Mars in about 5 to 6 months, but it's not going to have a lot left by the time it arrives. A further percentage of the fuel is going to be lost through boil-off. Although Methalox fuel doesn't lose as much through boil-off, it's still going to lose some. So by the time the Starship hits the Martian atmosphere, it's essentially going to be running on fumes, and it's going to be relying on the atmosphere to slow it down. It won't be landing in the method being depicted here. And this is where things get downright frightening, because terminal velocity on Mars, even though the gravity is only 1/3 of ours, is 1,000 kilometers per hour, 5 times what it is on Earth. The only exception to this is very close to the Martian surface, where the atmosphere becomes considerably more dense, and this is what the Starship needs to take advantage of. And this is why SpaceX is only giving themselves 3 minutes from 20 kilometers down to 0, because actually at terminal velocity it would take less than 1.5 minutes to cover that distance. However, with all of the flaps and other methods used to reduce the Starship's speed, once they get down to the altitude being depicted here, we're looking at about 250 kilometers per hour, or about 50 kilometers per hour higher than terminal velocity on Earth. Still fast, but manageable. And then making their turn at the last possible second for a landing, because that's the only thing that's going to work. So let's look at this again. The Starship, the moment it moves out of its belly flop mode, is going to accelerate to a speed of about 300 kilometers per hour at a height of only about 350 meters, and then is going to have to get down to 0 in that amount of time, in that amount of space. And just to use the skydiver analogy, few skydivers, even the most experienced, would pull their chute at that altitude, and especially at that kind of speed, and expect to survive by the time they reach the ground. So the Starship's engines are really going to have to work overtime at the last second in order to decelerate for a safe landing. And look, I'm not saying all of this just to get SpaceX fans enraged at me, although I might be too late for that at this point, but only to point out that this is going to be extremely difficult landing the Starship on Mars. This whole process is going to be very challenging, and we need to start testing conditions that at least come close to simulating it here on Earth as early as possible. Mars, as we have learned time and again, is an unforgiving planet when it comes to trying to land spacecraft. With an atmosphere only 1% that of Earth, it is extremely difficult to use conventional means of landing on the planet, especially if you're trying to land huge amounts of mass there. And it's not just because the atmosphere is thin. Mars has a climate, it has unpredictable wind patterns, and it also has regolith and rocks at the surface that are going to be kicked up like crazy by powerful rocket engines trying to land at the last moment. What's going to remain after you've used your rocket engines? Is it going to be a flat landing surface? Honestly, we really don't know, and we're not going to know until we execute tests on Mars itself. So when SN8 finally lights and heads up into the Texas sky, how much are we actually going to be learning? And by the way, this was provided by the generosity of Seabass, who is an unbelievable animator, and I'm sure you've seen his work before, but it's linked in the description. But what are we actually going to learn when this vessel achieves 15 kilometers and then starts its descent? Well, obviously, we're going to learn how well the ship performs with 3 Raptor engines instead of 1. We're also going to learn a little bit about the heat tiles and how well they stay attached to the structure when the pressures of the fuel and the cryogenics are taken into account. And when SpaceX kills the engines, we're going to learn exactly what happens when a rocket becomes a skydiver for the first time, actually, in aviation history. And this is going to be quite an amazing and rather exciting moment. We're going to learn how effectively the ship performs in Earth's atmosphere, how controllable it is in Earth's atmosphere, how fast it descends in Earth's atmosphere. I think you're getting the point here. We're going to learn a lot about how the ship will perform in Earth's atmosphere. But as far as Mars is concerned, it's going to be a lot different. And by the way, I hope we get to see that last second pull-up. That will be an important moment too. Because if SpaceX can consistently pull this off on Earth, they might have a chance on Mars, although that is by no means assured. But if we can't, then we may have to look for a different solution, something like this, a purely powered descent, although we certainly would never have this many ships this close together. But this would be a preferred method if we only had the fuel. And this is why in my videos, I constantly look for alternatives to the Starship Suicide Dive, because I am concerned that what works on Earth may not work on Mars. And this is why I advocate things like propellant depots in Earth orbit, or perhaps in lunar orbit if we can find a way to manufacture Methalox fuel there, so that we can actually fill the Starship up with the equivalent of 13 tankers without actually having to launch 13 tankers. If we had that much fuel available, we might be able to carry out a powered descent on Mars, or at least enter orbit. This is also why I advocate a base on Phobos, because Phobos almost certainly has the necessary materials to manufacture Methalox fuel, and if we can completely fuel up the Starship before it makes its landing attempt, then a powered landing becomes even easier. Or we could simply transfer the cargo from the Starship to smaller vessels on Phobos and down to the Martian surface. And by the way, I have an upcoming video that involves the Starship, Mars Base Alpha, and a certain vessel that was recently announced that clearly has Mars in mind, as you can see from the top right corner, because I just like thinking outside the box about these things. But I think it's important that we all start thinking this way, because this planet is not going to give up its secrets easily, and if we fail to respect that, the Starship Suicide Dive might become exactly that. So, I hope you've been able to see from the course of the video that the landing procedure, as far as we know for Mars, could be extremely problematic for what I like to call the Starship Suicide Dive. I'm not saying it's impossible. There's nothing in the laws of physics that says that it's impossible. However, and also, by the way, I want to make something clear in terms of the whole skydiver approach could very well work on Earth extremely well, and we're going to have lots of opportunities to test it. But on Mars, when you're looking at trying to be a giant skydiver and the terminal velocity is 1,000 kilometers per hour instead of 200, No skydiver would be tremendously enthusiastic about those conditions unless they really wanted a quick thrill before they ended their lives rather abruptly because their parachutes wouldn't work either. But all of that having been said, I'm not going to sit here and say that it's impossible, that this can't be accomplished. But what I am saying is that 200 tons being decelerated just by the Martian atmosphere until the last possible second is going to be very difficult to accomplish. It's going to require a lot of testing that honestly we don't have the luxury to carry out, or rather, SpaceX doesn't. They aren't going to have hundreds of attempts the way they can on Earth in order to make sure that they have the process down proper, as we've reviewed in the video. So I think it's very much in Elon Musk's interest to be looking at alternatives to this approach when it comes to Mars, because we're already doing it when it comes to the moon. Obviously, this approach can't work with the moon. There's no atmosphere. So perhaps we should be looking at this approach with Mars as well, more of a powered approach or some other alternative to this particular kind of landing. Once again, not as our first option, but as a fallback in case we have more failures than we have successes, or if we just have too many failures to be acceptable when it comes to putting passengers on board, especially if we're talking about dozens and dozens of passengers. And I want to make one other thing completely clear. I am very pro Starship. I want to see this work. I want a colony of 1 million people on Mars. I want all of these things very badly. I'd love to be a part of that colony if somehow that could be accomplished. I want all of these things to happen. But for all of us that want these things to happen, I think that it's also very responsible for us to ask these questions rather than blindly trust SpaceX. Because just like any other extremely specialized field, engineering doesn't always see all of the options, the broad picture. Hyper specialized people don't always see everything. And that was the case with Elon Musk when he first started out. He wasn't a rocket scientist, he was a physicist. And the people in Russia treated him like garbage because of that. And yet, look who turned out to be right. And that's something that we, as SpaceX enthusiasts and SpaceX supporters, should also do as well. So, now that I've gotten through, I think, probably irritating a number of people, but I hope also opening the eyes of some other folks as well, always got to talk about this coffee cup. Still heading towards 40,000 subscribers. Still want to blow it up in the worst kind of way. And as I'm sure a lot of you have noticed, once again, I'm listing my Patreon supporters as their numbers have continued to increase. And without you, I wouldn't be able to do these kinds of videos. And I am very, very appreciative for that. So until the moments of truth comes with this 15-kilometer hop or whatever it ends up being, and we see the results of it and what that tells us about what's coming for the future, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.